Hello, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Brent Aiken, David Pruitt, and Russell Martin. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, Brent Aiken. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you and invite you over to our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our previous episodes, show notes, and blog articles. Our goal is that you are inspired, encouraged, and the things that you hear on this podcast can equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you're serving in. Today, we are sitting down with Derry Prenkert, and I don't want to steal his thunder, so I'm going to let him share about himself. So Derry, welcome to the show. What do you do? Who are you? Family, all the fun stuff that you want to tell us. Man, we want to hear it.
Awesome. Hey, Brent. It's awesome to be on here. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of a conversation. So yeah, I am, the backstory on me is I'm a longtime youth minister. As a sophomore in college, I got approached by a guy that met me as a seventh grader, and he asked me if I'd be interested in doing an internship as I was in college at a church that was a half mile from the high school I graduated from. Had a lot of respect for the guy, was pursuing ministry. So I started there. That was 1996. And when 1999 rolled around, he offered me a job at that same church. And I was at that church. I said yes. And I was at that church until 2019 in different roles in student ministry. So in the town, I lived in a half mile from the high school I graduated from. And in that time was the games guy with middle school, then the assistant high school pastor or assistant to the high school pastor. I say I was the Dwight Schrute of that high school ministry. And then I was high school pastor, then student pastor, then next gen pastor, and everything in between. So did that. And then in 2019, not out of church hurt, not of anything bad. The Lord just opened the doors for me to head down to Louisville, Kentucky, to a church down there. I didn't say I was Northern Indiana was where I was at for all that time, and went in November 2019 down to a church called Southeast Christian Church, and worked on, it was a multi-site church, worked there in the satellite campus, in the student ministry, oversaw the team 4 months before COVID hit. So if you can just feel with me for a moment, 24 years at one church. That's my hometown, 43 years. And then moved down there, COVID hit, and it was a really tough season. It was a great church. And I think I understand why God had us down there. We needed to, there would need to be a voice that just wasn't a part of things, a big part of, the whole thing of COVID was just, nobody had done it before, right? So unless
Sure.
they were ministering during the Spanish flu, which I don't think many of us were. So just to be the person that was there, where everybody, like a lot of homegrown folks going, I don't know, we've just never done this. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. This is my first time in Louisville, Kentucky at this church, and was able to do some things. But during that time, and in the time, probably right around 2017, and part of what moved me down to Kentucky was just growing in my heart towards student ministry. You're at a church that long, you start getting approached a lot on the questions of, hey, you want to come be our associate pastor? Hey, you want to be a lead pastor somewhere? And while I was up in Indiana, it's just like, no. In fact, threw up in my mouth a little bit every time people would ask me to be a lead pastor. I knew that wasn't what I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
And what was happening and what brought me down to Kentucky was, I noticed this like little subtle shift from youth ministry to really just having a passion for youth ministers, developing interns in our program. And then the amount of times I was sitting with youth pastors and just, facing like the reality of just the need to have a space with somebody that was maybe a little seasoned to talk through the value I had in that. I had an incredible mentor. That guy that approached me as an intern was my boss for all those 23 years. And he was incredible. I had amazing community when I was down in Kentucky. And I just realized, I think where the second half of my ministry career is just a little subtle shift from youth ministry really to youth minister. And so that's the not so short version of what leads to where I'm at today, where I've joined a ministry called Standing Stone Ministry. It's a nonprofit ministry that really the heart of it is shepherding shepherds. and we exist to provide free and confidential conversations to pastors that are at the risk of leaving ministry early. That's like the adage of it. My heart
Yeah.
is student pastors. I go 3 categories. If you're starting, you're just getting going, and you're like, I don't, maybe starting at a new church or starting a ministry altogether, and I just need somebody to talk to process through. If you're stuck, where it's like things aren't horrible, but I'm just in this blockade. I can't figure out if this is the right church or how to handle this relationship, or just a little bit of a stuck moment. And then if you're straight up struggling, like, man, my marriage is about ready to fall apart, I just got fired, and just being available to that. So that's like the ministry. Real quick, family side. Met my wife in college. We were married. She was called to ministry, not to be a pastor's wife, but ultimately we have partnered together in so many different ways. We were married in 2000. We have 4 kids. One adopted from in-state in Indiana. One adopted from out of state in North Carolina. One adopted from Uganda, and then one biological child. We got a lot of DNA in our house.
That's awesome,
and
dude.
And the oldest is now a sophomore. The next oldest is a middle schooler. So I've got youth ministry in my own home that we're working through as well. So that's it. Now I'm back in Northern Indiana, walking you through the crazy web of stuff. I'm back in Northern Indiana. I attend as a volunteer at the church that I pastored at for 23 years. And I work in middle school ministry for the guy I hired. I help with the programming as a volunteer. I always said, if I'm not going to be a pastor in church, I want to be the best volunteer I possibly can. And it's really hard being a volunteer, man. It's really hard.
Yeah.
I have a new respect for them.
Yeah, it's volunteers are the front line, and we don't realize that as much as we need to. And that's an episode in and of itself. But
sure.
With that being said, we are talking today, and you've kind of already gone into it with the history that you talked about a little bit. We're talking today about the danger of loneliness. And I think that's something that, I don't know, especially, I guess, as a younger youth pastor, which I'm in my 13th year now. And as a younger youth pastor, I would hear the danger of loneliness and be like, oh, I'm not lonely. Like, I can do this, blah, 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 like, no big deal. And so I guess it's something almost that we have blinders on when it comes to this conversation. But I think this is one of the most important conversations to have outside of actually how to do ministry and how to have those gospel conversations. Because the thing is, I mean, you yourself have to be proficient in what you do, and part of proficiency is not being on an island by yourself. And so what is the danger of loneliness other than that? I mean, where do we start this conversation?
Yeah, man. Well, I'll start it with my early phase. Like, I hope you caught it. You talked to a lot of youth pastors or pastors in general have been doing this for a really long time. There's some wounded moments along the way, probably, and blow up moments and different things. And I definitely have those. I have the elder that chewed me out for I don't know why, the coworker that made me want to quit every other day, the parent that just misunderstood where I was at, all that stuff. But I also have some incredible people that invested in me. And one of those was right when I was starting off in ministry, before I went from the intern world to full time. The senior pastor of the church in Napanee, small town Indiana, who had been there for 21 years already, took me out to lunch. And in that time, he said, "Hey, ask me anything. Just ask me anything you want." And as the young guy, I'm thinking, what can I do to really impress him? And so I got a good one. I'm going to ask him. So what's the one thing in ministry that, as a guy that's getting ready to go into this, that probably is a bigger deal than I realize, that I need to be aware of? I nailed it. Great question. And he, without skipping a beat, he said, ministry is far more lonely than you'd ever imagine. And then it's stuck in my brain forever. He said, "Don't get me wrong. You'll always be surrounded by people, but you'll often feel like you're the only one." And I just would say, if you're in youth ministry and you haven't felt that yet, I'd love to get to know, and you've been for a long season. If you haven't had moments where it's like, man, I'm around people all the time, but I just feel alone. And it comes in a lot of forms. And I don't know, maybe Brent, you have your moments that you can come up with it, but ones that come up for me are the times where I just feel like I'm sitting in a staff meeting and we're talking through some stuff about what we're doing and what we need to do as a church. And I feel like everybody's speaking German and I'm trying to speak English about how that affects my ministry.
Yeah.
And there's that. So there's even the moments among staff, if you're in a multi-staff situation where you're the sole student guy trying to speak on behalf of how something will affect your student ministry. And you just go, man, I think I'm the only one here. The moments when hanging out with friends and whether it's in the church or outside the church, and the topic of anything that comes up that doesn't feel super Christiany, and you can just feel the tone of the room change because they know the pastor's in the room.
Yeah.
And just like, man, okay, I get it. You guys, once you get out of here, you'll go have the real conversation, but you're going to keep your Christianese on for me. The times where things are going wrong and just the enemy gets into my head and begins to send lies to me to say, you know what, you're terrible at this. And, nobody else, no other youth pastor, no other pastor struggles with the doubts or the feelings that you have. And this isolation settles in. So those are the ones, I don't know what resonates with you, man, but those are the thoughts that come to mind for me.
All three of those very much. And then the only other one that I'd throw in, kind of how the conversation shifts and the conversation changes. The other fun one is when you get invited to a party, but the party really starts after you leave. Which is one of those things, like, it's the number of times we've been invited places, and then like we stay for an hour or two, and then we find out that the party lasted another 3 hours, and like all the I guess the entertaining tidbits of the party or whatever, whether it just be like a family town get together with a bunch of youth families or something like that, like it's something like, and it's not just privy to youth pastors. I do want to say that this is something across ministry lines,
absolutely,
where your senior pastor is probably feeling the same thing. Your children's pastor is probably feeling the same thing. But somehow or another, we have this notion of even isolating ourselves from the other ministers in our church, which is, I mean, it's not going to help you in the long run. And so it's something to be mindful of for sure. Absolutely,
man. I think it's a great point on being aware of it as a team. And I think even just talking about it, I'm grateful. You heard my story. I had a senior pastor. One of the first great pieces of advice he gives me is, we can't do this alone. And I would say that senior pastor was an amazing mentor in two ways. One was making sure that there were times we'd try to break through just the business conversations to have the heartfelt conversations, but also tons of freedom to recognize, those moments of, hey, Derry, this is a conversation that you need to have, and I'm probably not the guy to have it with because you're going to hold back on me, and an understanding in that, and allowing me the space in that. And that's probably another part to it, right? Like a part of the loneliness too. So I go into like why there's the reality of it, but then why do we let ourselves get isolated and lonely? I see two things that happen. One is there is just this high standard that's important in ministry. We're held to a high standard, the passages in James and the call of Paul to elders, to overseers, that definitely involves this high standard. But then it's like the high standard gets kicked up a notch more than I really believe is healthy, because we're still humans. Yes, saved by grace, but still walking in a fallen world that have our struggles. And the thought though of when I'm dealing with doubts, when Wednesday night is done and I'm sitting in my office knowing I need to go home, but I still don't know what to do. That was my time. Or Thursday morning when I wake up and the temptation level is high to just check out and do nothing. Like, who do I share, and where do I share appropriately those struggles, those doubts, those questions? And so that brings in loneliness. I think the other factor is ministry is exhausting. It's really exhausting. And the number one source of that exhaustion is people. So I'm in this place, back to what my senior pastor said, you'll be surrounded by people all the time, but you'll often feel like you're the only one. There's also the side of, I think about those parties. How many Saturday nights have my wife and I said, we got to check out early because we got to get up tomorrow, and I'm tired, and I got to be ready to people like crazy tomorrow morning. And so I can't people too much. And so there's almost the side of, I need to get around other people, but I've been around so many people. I just need some time by myself. But then when I'm by myself, I'm really lonely, right? So
Yeah.
those two factors I look at and say, like, I guess I want to share that, for us to just go, let's give ourselves a little bit of grace, maybe an understanding of the fact that this comes from a place that makes sense. It doesn't make it right.
Yeah. And I think there's a big spectrum when it comes to that because also, I mean, you have introverted pastors and you have extroverted
Mm-hmm.
pastors, but then when you get into the realm of you having a spouse and a family too, that brings a whole different dynamic because it's one of those things. I officiated a wedding this past Saturday and
Okay.
we left at in the middle of the dancing and it was just like, hey, like, sorry guys, like I have to be at church at 7 in the morning. Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I need to go home. But I had to fight that tendency. But then also I was like, like man, my parents like they're watching the kids tonight. Like we have no children tonight. Like we could like stay out. We could like
Yeah.
go do something kind of thing. And so it was one of those things. And I kind of wanted to stay out because I'm the extroverted one in our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But my wife was like, I'm done. Like I'm peopled
Yeah.
out. Like I need to just go do something alone with you.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that be we go home and watch a movie, or whether that be we go to Sonic and get a drink or something to that nature, or whatever. She said
Yeah.
I need to be away from people, and so
Yeah.
you even have that kind of dynamic. And I think
That's
that
good.
there's definitely heavy seasons of loneliness where those just kind of hit even harder.
Mm-hmm.
Because man, I think I think ministry altogether knows no harder season of life than a newborn.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, man.
when your spouse or when you are home with a newborn and you're trying to do said job,
Mm-hmm.
um, talk about isolation and lonely because you're trying to come home and be that support structure and that support system, but then also you have all of these things that you're supposed to do, but you don't feel like you need to be there because you feel like you need to be home helping. There's a
Yeah.
huge avenue of that, and that's where most youth pastors sit, right in that realm of like either in college, freshly married, or early
Mm-hmm.
kids is where most
Yep.
youth pastors sit. And so that definitely breeds into loneliness as well as just the mindset of like, what season are you in? Because there are so many different things that can kind of add to it.
Yeah, you're so right, man. As you're saying that, I was thinking, yeah, except this is the beauty. A part of what I love I get to do is those 23 years. I walked through about every transition you need to think through. So I went
Yeah.
from single to married. I went from no kids to first kid to second kid to third kid to
Yeah.
fourth kid. Now, if anybody has like 7 or 8 kids, I can't walk through that, but I did all that.
I don't want to walk through that. I'm just going to go ahead and say, like,
Yeah, right, right.
blessings to you. Like, you are amazing if you're listening and you have 8 kids or 7 kids, but you're
Yeah,
crazy. Like,
yeah, that's right. That's right. Especially if you're still doing youth ministry in the midst of that,
yeah.
man. Um, but I walked through a lot of that. I walked through a lot of the other things, and I was just thinking, is there a tougher transition than to that going with that first kid? And I can say there's probably some ties along the way. You're right. That's a hard transition, and it is a big part of um, more attention needing to be at home, and this community and this congregation that now is you're at home. That's no longer two; it's three. In that the 3 people in that home that you're working with, and the exhaustion tied with it. It is a big time, tough one. And then you throw in the lack of sleep, right?
Yeah.
For you, and more importantly, your wife if you're a dude. And then I think about my sisters in youth ministry who are navigating all this with a young child. I was just talking with somebody 2 weeks ago who's dealing
Yeah.
with that, like a mom who's leading the youth group with a newborn and trying to figure out, how do I find any community?
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. And then, like, I mean, I don't know where I know this is a conversation, so we can go a lot of trails in it. Then there's even the tension of making sure you and your spouse are finding good community
Yeah.
together, but also individual community. And then there's just this little game changer that's
Yeah.
entered the picture that just disrupts everything with that.
That's constantly changing.
Yeah,
I mean, once you
yeah,
feel like you have it, it's a completely different challenge.
yeah, yeah. Let me ask you this. I'm curious how you'd respond to this. This has been one I've been thinking through. And again, remember, I'm saying I've been a part of some great church communities. I was in a cohort. My wife and I were in a cohort of youth pastors, and we were sharing about balancing marriage and ministry. And somebody asked, how do you find good and safe community inside your church congregation? And
Hmm.
my wife and I looked at each other. This wasn't like 10 years ago. This was like 6 months ago.
Yeah.
We looked at each other and we kind of struggled on that answer. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
I mean, my initial gut reaction is we don't. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like, because, like, I mean, it's such a loaded avenue. And I mean, thankfully, like you, I work in a church that I love, and I do have that avenue where I can go in, and my wife and I are involved in a community group on Sunday nights because we do youth on Wednesday nights. And like we treat and value that time as sacred. Like we do not miss it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of even add to it. Our kids are 10 and almost 8. And
Yeah.
so, for any people that think this is wrong, I'm sorry, but we let our kids stay home because we only let our kids play screens on the weekends. And so we
Mm-hmm.
let screens babysit them during this time.
Yeah.
Um, and so we leave and we go do dinner as a date night right before our community group. And like that is we have time together, but then we have time in community with other people that are close to our age. And so we try to do our best efforts to make that and keep that a thing. But like, this is the first place. And I'm in my 7th year, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm in my 7th out of 13 years total at
Yeah.
this church. But the 2 churches before that, we had nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I did not feel like we had any adequate area to go to. I did not feel like we had any group that we could be a part of. And anytime we were invited to something, we felt out of place.
Yeah.
I remember going to a Sunday school Christmas party because my wife was involved in a Sunday school class at one of our previous churches, and like we left
Hmm.
because it became very not Christian Sunday school Christmas party quickly.
Yeah.
And it was just like sometimes even that kind of breeds loneliness and guilty because like when typically when you come into youth ministry or when you're called to be a minister, you feel like you're led to like live the life that we speak of in a lot
Mm-hmm.
of ways. And sure, I mean we all have downsides and we all fail, but like I think conviction hits. And it's like, man, I don't want to be doing this. And so that also kind of just breeds isolation because the rest of the world looks at us like, oh, well, they're too good. They can't like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, no, like God told us not to do that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
so, I mean, it adds to it. But to answer your question, I think there are safe opportunities for community in some churches, but it's honestly a dime a dozen. Like
Yeah.
there, it's not something that you can find in every church.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
so
yeah.
I I think that's the importance of finding community elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, for the people that are listening to this, statistically, you are the only youth pastor in your church.
Correct.
You might even be the only not senior pastor minister
Right.
in this church.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so to say that you have a community within your building, let alone a community within your staff, is probably not realistic.
Right.
And so, yeah, there were many, many times and seasons in our lives where we had to go outside of our church
Mm-hmm.
to find community.
Yeah. Yep. And see, it's really fascinating to hear you say that. Like, again, this is just two dudes talking, so we
Yep.
can't say because our stories are similar. It's true of everyone, but I will say I would resonate a lot with what you just said. Where we have some great friends at our church.
Yeah.
We really do, and we have through the years. But when we got asked that question, we kind of went on this not downward spiral, but the spiral down to like some root stuff to say, okay, so what have been the moments where it didn't work? We couldn't find healthy community inside a church,
Yeah.
and where did we? And there were a couple things that we realized. One was we just hated the moments when we go into this space going, we just want to connect and hang and have it be Jesus centered. But as that person on staff, if you're in the room, and a question gets asked that's like deeply theological, or what's the church doing? Where do all the eyes go in the group?
Yeah.
Boom, right to you. And you're like, I thought I was just coming here to like talk about us, you know?
Yeah.
There's that side. Then there was this whole thing for my wife, especially, who she was actually on staff for a lot of the time. So we were both on staff, but she especially felt this when it fell under the umbrella of Napanee Missionary Church. That was our church. And so it was like a quote sponsored, brought to you by Napanee, this small group experience. There was something where immediately there, even just that thought in her head was, okay, we're here because we have to be. This is a part of the job. And so there's that mentality of it. And so we started thinking about it, and where we found the best community in seasons was when we really vetted. I mean, to be blunt, vetted the people we were talking to. We're a little cautious at first on how much we shared, and paid attention if we shared some personal challenge stuff, if it stayed there or not, and saw that we could build trust. So it took a little bit of time, and we really, really found our ways to make it more organic and not tied to the church. Now, again, I'm not saying that everybody needs to do that, but for maybe if somebody's listening to this and they're wrestling through it, I'll just throw those two things out. When people like Marty and Mindy and Dan and Katie, and Jess and Jason, like these are people that we look to a lot of times who, and interestingly, all those people I brought up, I can think of. One was the daughter of a youth pastor for years. The other were volunteers in our ministry who we knew before we were pastors. But when we found the time to just connect and hang out outside of it. So I think that's just something I would throw out, because I hope this isn't a discouraging conversation. I hope it's like, one thing I love is when I can sit with a youth pastor and they can just go, oh, so I'm not the only one that's felt that way. And
Exactly.
we just kind of had that moment, right? Oh, okay. Like I'm sad for you, but I'm a little relieved to know that you've wrestled with that same thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, but then to say, hey, it can be possible. There can be ways around it. And I think that's so important, because I know we want to spend some time talking about the networking side of this and how that plays in. That affects me as the pastor more than my spouse, usually.
Sure.
I mean, there's not a lot of networking done among spouses. Something I've wondered, what would it look like? And actually my wife and I are dreaming through questions about that. What would it look like? But finding the way to get that community inside and connection and relationship inside of your church, or maybe it's not right inside your church, but at least in your community, is so important for our spouses, for those of us who are married. So we'll throw that out.
No, and I think that's been one thing that's definitely been on my mind as well, is just I think, like I said, now we're in a spot where that has more support, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then it's kind of also gotten to the point to where my wife, I think another thing is, like, especially when you have a spouse that is in ministry, that you clearly define your roles. Like your side is different than my side. We can overlap on occasion, but like, you are called to do your ministry, I'm called to do my ministry. But then the other part is when your spouse is not called to ministry, clearly define those roles. My wife is not required by the church to do anything in the church, and I made that clear when we got here. It was like, my wife is not going to lead Sunday school unless she wants to. She's not going to be the women's event leader or anything else. Like, my wife is going to be involved where she wants to be involved, because she has a full-time job too, and she wants to be a active member and an active part of our church body with volunteering and everything else. But like, she's going to choose to get to do what she wants to do. And I think that there is tremendous health in that. And so I think that there comes to the point where you can get that. But I think a lot of churches use and abuse that as well. So having that network of spouses, and I always go back to military. I'm not military, but I have always looked and idolized at the network that is built within military families. And just the mindset of, like, when the husband is deployed, or when the wife is deployed for 6-8 months, a year, like, the rest of the families that are at that base, like they have networks and all kinds of community that's just kind of built in and overlaps around what they're
Mm-hmm.
doing and where they are. And I'm like, man, why can't the church do that? Like,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's something that is, I mean, honestly, that's what keeps marriages intact in the military.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, like, I think that
Yeah.
that needs to be a model that is followed in many different areas,
Yeah.
because the danger of loneliness and isolation is not just you, it's anyone in your family. And we could
Correct.
go into the conversation for an entire hour on how your spouse feels isolated and lonely, how your kids, when you have kids, feel isolated
Yeah.
and lonely. Um, and
Yeah.
it's something that needs to be worked on for sure.
For sure. Little thought to go with that is, well, kind of a two-side thing. One is there's that part as we're talking, I'm like, I immediately want to go into fix it mode. Well, how do we deal with that? And because there's not somebody that's reaching out and saying, hey, I want to create a network of spouses. And then I kind of want to look at my spouse and go, well, why don't you be the one to do it? And then she just like wants to smack me upside the head. Like, you really think I'm dying for community, that leading something is what I need, right?
Yeah.
So in that, at the risk of sounding super, just trite spiritual statement of, the reason we don't have sometimes is we don't ask. Like, what if that's a matter of prayer? Like, God, would you bring somebody or something into our lives or into my spouse's life that could be life-giving in a network of things?
Yeah.
There's actually at a church that I know and love dearly, somebody that's an adult daughter of a pastor who just watched The Loneliness Factor, who has a small group for all the pastors' wives, and she leads it. She works in the marketplace. She leads it, and she has set up like strict rules of how it works. Of, this is a safe space. We'll lean in, and it's so tricky for her, because obviously when they get together, they're talking through some stuff of how they feel about the church and everything else, and trying to guard and
Yeah.
navigate it. But she says to me, Derry, it's worth the risk. I will risk even some hurt feelings inside of that to at least have them be shared and expressed. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just am like, I find myself praying regularly that there will be something like that. So
Yeah.
there's that thought. The second thought is, I think this is a great one for us to keep in mind as ministers when we have a kid of a pastor that's not ours in our youth group. So if I have the senior pastor's kid, if I have the children's pastor's kid, or just anybody on the staff, how am I making sure to not continue to add to the unneeded expectations on them that will make them feel set apart, different, unique? And even one that I think is really important is finding the balance of calling out the gold and leadership in a kid, but making sure that in that, because a lot of times, how do we call out the gold? We're like, you know what? I see more in you, and I expect more in you because I see more in you. Well, that pastor's kid, when I say I expect more in you, their mind's me going, yeah, because of my dad or my mom.
Yeah.
Right. Versus, and so that's when I'm trying to watch, and I'm watching it my own kids, where I don't think the last thing my son and daughter need is, I expect more in you during these times. The thing they need is, hey, here's how I see you. Here's what I see in you, and here's the gold that I see coming out in you.
Sure.
And maybe worth taking into account for others, but especially for the kids, because there's this weird, everybody knows you, but nobody really knows you thing for the kids. So man.
Like I said, it's across the family. It's not just you, for sure. But I think I think this is a good transition spot.
Sure.
We know the danger of loneliness. We've talked about it for 30-ish minutes now.
Yeah.
How do we combat? How do we prevent? And then how do we work to instill a future where that doesn't creep back in?
Yeah. So this is where I think a big part of the conversation can become, especially the value of networking with other youth ministers. Now, Brent, we literally have known each other for all of about a week through messages, and this is the first time I've talked to you face to face. So I don't know your story at all. What is give me a little bit of feel of your youth ministry networking experience? Positive, negative, neutral, existent, non-existent. What's that looked like for you?
So as far as youth ministry networking, I kind of took it into my own hands because it was non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
And so back, they're not what they used to be because they were kind of bought out and moved. But back when it was, I call it the battle of the Facebook networks because it was like Download Youth Ministry and
Mm-hmm.
YouthMen.org and all of
Mm-hmm.
those. I was pretty heavily involved in YouthMen.org,
Mm-hmm.
did some stuff with them, and at my last church, there was just a season where that loneliness hit. That isolation hit real hard. It was during my first child. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and not only first child, like we had our first kid, and then a month later, we moved across Texas um, for a full time job so I could provide for said, child and wife. And so not only did we start a new phase of life, but we started in a town where we knew nobody.
Yeah.
Closest
Okay.
family was 4 or 5 hours away. And that loneliness hit real quick. And so I just
Mm-hmm.
got on. I was like, does anybody want to just get on a Google Hangout because Zoom wasn't really a thing yet?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
does anybody just want to get on Google Hangout and just talk about life, talk about ministry, and stuff like that? And so I got on and just posted that on one of the Facebook groups, and I had like 6 to 8 people say, "Yeah, like I'd love to."
Mm-hmm.
And that group has kind of migrated and changed over the years, but like to this day,
Hmm.
I think it's been a decade now. We have a ongoing group on Facebook Messenger where we literally talk daily.
Yeah.
And it's so we kind of started it. We did the Google Hangout conversations every Thursday morning, which is kind of why my reasoning for
Mm-hmm.
doing episodes on Thursday mornings for the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we literally did this community conversation for, I think we did Google Hangouts almost every Thursday for like 3.5, 4 years.
Yeah.
Um, and so this network was built, this community was built. We had a few people change jobs and a few people change churches where Thursday mornings weren't really a thing anymore. And so we kind of shifted to a Facebook conversation instead. But that conversation still is going healthily and active. A lot of the people have transitioned out of youth ministry
Mm-hmm.
or transitioned out of church ministry altogether, and now they're
Yeah.
teachers or
Okay.
some of them are senior pastors, and so all of this stuff has happened. And um, in the grand scheme of things, like my networking came out of me just being in that place, and I was like, hey, I
Yeah.
can't be the only one.
Yeah. Right.
And so I
Love it.
stepped in, and now seeing the benefit of what that did for me, like I have stepped into the role where I consider, like, I think if you pass that 10-year mark, honestly, even nowadays, if you pass that 7 or 8 year mark, I consider you a veteran.
Yep. I'd
And
agree.
you need to be pouring back into the young guys. And
Mm-hmm.
so I work to help run all of the community youth pastor engagement in my community. We're a
Okay.
town of 130, 140,000 people. And all the youth pastors, well, all the youth pastors are invited. Not all of them show up, but all of the youth pastors are invited to come together and meet twice a
Yeah.
month. We do
Okay.
first Thursday and third Thursday, which once again, Thursdays. It's like it kind of stuck with me or something.
Yeah, man.
But so yeah, we do first Thursday coffee and third Thursday lunch. Just for different time frames so different people can meet.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't make coffee, maybe you can make lunch or vice versa. And that's where a lot of conversation comes into play. It's just an opportunity for, like you said earlier, I mean, you're not alone, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a difference between you're not alone online on a computer screen talking to someone that's 400 miles away, or like, hey, this church is down the street. Like this
Yeah.
youth pastor is going through the same thing that I am, which is super important. And so mine was kind of built from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
The community youth pastor stuff in my town right now was already going when I got here.
Okay.
And I just kind of took it over when another youth pastor wanted to transition out of it.
Yeah.
Um, but so
Yeah.
then, I mean, everything, the reason that we do the podcast, everything
Mm-hmm.
is just so that someone listening to this can hear and hopefully say, just like you said earlier, like, oh, wow. Like, I hate that you're going through that, but
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know anybody else was kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So,
I love hearing that journey. And I'm like, oh, Brent, that's how I know your name. Youthman.org. Okay, I get it.
I did a few things. I wasn't near as big as the
Yeah.
other guys, but
Sure. No, but that's so cool. Um, uh, I love hearing that journey, and you hit like so the two worlds I think that we just got to realize are right there. Um, Probably more than we think, but they can both be tricky. In the online and across the world, literally opportunities
yeah,
that we live in this space. And I think COVID only brought more to the top in some ways, but also
yeah,
made us a little like hate Zoom so much that we forget, no, this type of stuff can be so good. And then the in
sure,
community, but even in that, as you're talking, let me tell you why I hate networks too, like, which is weird
yeah,
to say. But I've been a part of some, and I find them probably more so. No, I can say on both ways of this battle, where I was at one of the larger churches in the community, and so I came in with this side, but then I could talk to people that I became really good friends that came from like the really small church, and the ego or the frustration or whatever that would walk in the doors at times just made me go, I don't even know if I want, like, and as the guy at the large church, like really the pure part of my heart was, I know that I'm frustrating a lot of these guys. I don't want to add to their frustration. I'm not going to go into that community and mess things up because they just like, I don't want them to feel like I'm coming in to steal their kids or, whatever, all that
yeah,
stupid stuff. Right. So there's that side of it. But even like just the side of walking in and the network coming in and going, okay, we're going to do this community wide event, and like immediately going to planning or talking strategies. There's that part. Then there's like when you're doing the online world, a little bit of that too, like the self promotion that can, like the people are going, hey, I want to come speak at your events, so that's why I'm doing it. I'm here so you can hire me to be your magician. Um, like really, that's what especially because really my heart has been in the times where I'm looking at that. I was like, I've been doing this long enough that I realize how much I don't have figured out. And I realize how much I love when I'm in a space, whether it's worshiping together or in conversation or even listening to somebody teach. And I know that the person on my right and my left loves students and is there for students, like, or when we're in conversation, like, it's just, there's something so sweet and special about it. That's what I want. So the best in-person network I was ever a part of, we met at the Pagoda Inn, a Chinese restaurant in Goshen, Indiana, and it was every other Thursday. So similar setup, and we'd grab lunch, and there was a guy there. His name was Redford. Redford was the senior saint of the youth pastors. Had been doing it for a long time,
yeah,
and he didn't really organize it, but I jumped in kind of the second wave of people that are part of it. Um, and the guy that had invited me in on it said, hey, watch Redford. He's a piece of work, man. And I was like, okay, I'm really intrigued to get to know this guy. What he would do is regularly, he would get mad at the group and say, stop it. Just shut up. Stop it. And that was like, he was known as that guy. But what it was the minute people started talking about numbers or started talking about like, hey, let's plan this event,
yeah,
he would just shut it down in the early phases. He's like, that guys, if that's what this is going to be, I'm out of here. I want this to be the space where we can come together. I don't, what the only things I care about your ministry is how it's affecting your heart and your mind and your soul. But I'd much rather hear about your families, your kids, your what you're
yeah,
personally wrestled through. Yeah, I want to celebrate what's happening in your ministry, but I'm not interested in that all. And he just like vigilantly made it. Now, am I saying it's wrong to come together as a community and plan things for your community? That's amazing. Like, it's
yeah,
awesome. All I know is like that the cool thing that happened was that group was meeting together and we prioritized first and foremost relationship. Then
yeah,
what happened was a community-wide see you at the pole rally started to come out of that, where even like one of the guys had a spouse who was highly involved at a local high school, where they let us use their auditorium to hold like Wednesday, everybody would go to their schools, but then we'd come to that school and we do a full together night of prayer and worship for God to move in our schools. A spring break trip formed out of that, with several of the churches saying, I really want to do something that's like leadership development. I'd love to do it over spring break, but it's going to cost a lot at the level I want to do it. And they came together and began to plan the spring break trip. But it was a bunch of friends doing it together. Like
Yeah.
in some ways, we even joke about the great part about doing the rally or the spring break trip is we get to kind of hang out with each other a little bit more.
Yeah.
And so like that factor, it's twofold. Is the mindset for those that are saying, man, I'm really lonely and I need something. Like, walk in with that mindset first and foremost. Not who can I
Yeah.
get some resources from? You know, how can I
Yeah.
learn from that church or get their stuff, or you know, instead, like, just who can I get to know and who can I talk with? Or if you're the person, like you said, Brent, I love that I love what you said about those that have been in this about 8 years or longer, is, hey, set the tone, be the one that walks in,
Yeah.
be the Redford, be the one that's going to come in. And when it starts going down that road, going, I don't care about your church right now. I care about you. What's going on with
Yeah.
you? Tell me more about what's a dream that you have
Yeah.
in for ministry right now, but it's yours and you haven't had a
Yeah.
space to share it. You know, like
Sure.
that's what we need to find. And so that's my little rant, but
No,
also it can
I
happen. I
agree.
think it can happen in both
100%.
places. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's that. I'm curious. So you talk about that Google Hangout group. My community that's like that has definitely come through Download Youth Ministry. So I got involved early on as an author. You know, being at one place, Josh Griffin met me at a conference, and he said, "Dude, you've been doing this for so long. You got to have stuff rotting away on your hard drive. Submit some of it. Let's see what could happen." And I did, and then I got invited into kind of this other community of authors. And the first time, interestingly enough, I met three people. I went to California to conference, and I reached out to Andrew Larson and Timothy Miller. Don't know if you know those names, but they were two of the
Yep.
big time authors with
Yeah.
sermon stuff. And then there's a guy named Ken Leslie out of Michigan, who the game Will It Burn is still one of my favorite games in the world. It just shows something you have to decide if when he puts a blowtorch on it, will it light up or not. But Ken, we decided, hey, let's meet for we had never met in person. He said, let's meet for lunch, and we were all super nervous about it. And Timothy tells the story about we met at Disneyland in downtown Disney. We grabbed lunch, and he said, I got in with him, but then I ran quick. I didn't have a chance to go to the bathroom. After about 15 minutes, like, guys, I'm sorry, I got to go to the bathroom. Timothy said, when I got up, Andrew, who they were really good friends, leaned over to Timothy, goes, dang it, I kind of like Derry. and because, you
He's
know,
not coming back.
we were these authors that
Yeah.
that, you know, saw ourselves at times maybe competitive to each other.
Yeah.
And he was like, is Derry going to leave? And then also it was like, I don't know. I kind of not sure if I wanted to like him, you know, because of that. Well,
Yeah.
instead, what's really cool, Brent, and I wonder if you have this. So all those guys are a part of a text thread that I'm a regular part of. Also, Andrew and Timothy live down in Tampa Bay, and my family, we have a sickness. It's called Disney World, and the only cure is more Disney World. And whenever we go down to Disney, Andrew and Timothy and Andrew's 4 kids, Timothy's 5 kids, and my 4 kids, we all meet up at Disney for a day and spend the time
That's
together.
cool.
Our families have gotten to know each other. There's a we have these amazing pictures of us all together, and it's turned into this thing that was so much more than I expected. So I've got the
That's
one
super
story
cool.
of where it did start with relationship and moved into, quote, business. Another one, it was business, but then it moved into relationship.
Yeah.
But on either one, I'll tell you, the business is not what I value the most. It's the
Yeah.
community. So anyway, man, I don't
100%.
know. Like, I don't know if you've in your Google group, if those moments, your Google Hangout, if there's those moments you've been able to meet in person where it's so sweet, but it's a pretty special thing when that starts to happen.
We've had a few of us meet up, and we haven't necessarily done where like all of our families have gotten together. We've talked about it a few times, but schedules just couldn't
Mm-hmm.
line up.
Yeah.
Because like literally we're all over the country.
Yeah.
But we've had a few times where we've actually been like, hey, like this conference is coming up. Why don't as many of us as possible all come to the
Yep.
same conference and just hang? And so
Yeah.
we had one
Yeah.
or two times where we had like, I think the group is like 10 of us, 12 of us, and we had a solid 7 of us go to the same conference, just so we could
Right.
actually hang out and meet and just goof off together. And it was a lot of fun. We enjoyed it a lot. But
Yeah.
it's just especially as you get older, there's more scheduling things and more time
Sure.
conflicts and everything else, and it gets harder to pull families away. But it's been something we've wanted to do for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, you said it though. Like that's the beauty is the conference is a brilliant spot. It's like you use the conference as the excuse to hang out
Yeah.
and finding that. And I think, I guess like, as we're talking about this, I think if I were to try to sum up the heartbeat of where I'm living at in this time for the youth ministry world is, don't network for the sake of the benefit of your ministry. Network for the sake of the benefit of the minister. Like
Yeah.
start there, understanding that you need this space, especially as a minister. And look at it as this way. The phrase I use a lot of times when people I'm sitting with is, I want to be that place where you're constantly saying, there's nobody who gets it when it comes to blank. Let me be the person that can fill in the blank to go, this person gets it. Derry gets it. And where are you going? And I think that's where this idea of networking, yeah, awesome. I want to see communities come to know Jesus. I want to see schools come alive. And there's no question it's worth it. I just have this sneaking suspicion that it will always be more effective when it starts and is focused on the health of the minister connecting. And honestly, if that other stuff doesn't happen, it's still, it's so worth it. So,
yeah.
I
just want to reiterate what you just said. Don't network for the ministry, network for the minister. Like,
yeah.
Talk about a nugget of gold. And if you hear anything else, anything in this conversation, that's it.
Yeah.
And that will, we typically do a episode post the Monday after, and that's totally the quote for this episode.
Love it.
Man, what a valuable nugget of wisdom, because I think a lot of times we do go into conferences and we go and do all these things, but it's very much oh, how can I make this better kind of thing. I need to learn from the best and the brightest and everything else. And it's maybe we just need to better ourselves before we better our ministry. And sometimes that's through personal development, but a lot of times that's just through connection and relationship. And so, gosh, man, that I'm going to have to chew on that quote for a little bit. That was a really, really good line. I like that a lot.
Yeah. There you go.
But that's the point, and that's the focus of why we do what we do. Our goal is if we are genuinely trying to teach students that we're not in this alone, I think we need to be living that on the forefront of our own lives as well, as we are not alone in this. And I think ministers can be some of the worst at loneliness.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. And I don't know if you caught the Barna Research did this big project out of COVID, and where they came out and said 42% of pastors, senior pastors, seriously considered quitting. It jumped up by another 5-6% of pastors under 40. And they identified 5 factors. Number one, by far, was stress of the job. Number 2 was loneliness. Number 3 was the political climate. And those 3 rose way above the 4 and 5.
Yeah.
But what I think is really interesting was the number 1 and 2 of the extreme stress of the job and loneliness. I would just say which one is completely unbiblical to live in. Stress. Yeah. I'm sorry. If you read the scriptures, stress is a part of life. If you're going to follow Jesus, Jesus said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. It's going to happen. If we're going to live for the sake, now there's a point of too much stress. Don't hear me saying you're in a toxic situation, you need to get out. But that's a reality. There is nothing biblical about loneliness. There is nothing where you can say it's okay for me. And now, is it okay to be off in isolation? Yes. But to say I'm lonely, and that was the number one. That was the first crisis of mankind. God looked down and said it's not good for man to be alone. And so it's just a thing where when I look at those factors, I say, yeah, I get how that first one's the factor, but I bet that first one of the stress was a factor. I don't. There's something in my stress levels just immediately go down when I get to talk to somebody else, and they go, man, I've been there, or man, I'm there too. And they don't even have to solve anything. Right. So that's why we're terrible at it. And I think part of why we're terrible at it is because there's an enemy that's prowling around like a lion, seeking who to devour, and who better to devour than the ones that are leading others. And
Sure.
I'll just give you this, and we probably getting close to shutting it down. Somebody talked to me about that First Peter passage, and two things are really interesting in it. It actually comes right after Peter takes time talking to overseers and to young people. So he's talking to the ministers, and he says, watch out for the lion who's prowling around like a lion. My friend went on a safari in Africa, and he actually had that golden moment where there's this huge pack of gazelles, and they pulled up on a lion crouching down, and they're like, oh, it's game on. We're going to get to see this, and they're watching, and they're like, okay, when is this lion going to just tear into the pack? And the safari guide said, no, that's not how it works. Watch for the gazelle that wanders off by itself. That's when they attack. And I just think about that whole picture of First Peter of your enemy, the devil's prowling around like a lion, seeking for someone to devour.
Yeah.
And he's talking to these ministers, and maybe that's the takeaway for us in this conversation. And it's one I'm constantly reminding myself is two questions I ask a lot of times when I sit with ministers is, where am I prone to isolation? So where or when? What are the times or places when I can tend to want to just go off by myself?
Sure.
And then the next question is, when is that healthy and when is it unhealthy? Because there are times where I need to get off by myself to replenish, to get with the Lord. And that's probably about, on the pie graph, about 20% of the time that it's really, really healthy. And then the other times that are unhealthy, like where are those that I need to be aware of them? And then where do I go to? So I hope that's like maybe the part we can run with in this.
That's real good. Golly. Yeah, that's just putting the visualization of the lion and the gazelles into that mindset of like, it's not, I think a lot of times it's like, well, Satan's just waiting to attack our church. It's like, no, Satan's waiting to attack the one minister that goes a little bit out of tangent with the rest of them. And then he knows that that's going to breed dissension and breed all kinds of difficulties that come in. That's so good.
Yeah.
So
it's like
good.
Scripture's powerful or something, man. Right. And God was speaking through it. It's crazy. But yeah, it's a beautiful picture, a terrifying and sad picture, but it's a beautiful picture to hold on to for us to learn from, man.
Yeah. No, golly, nuggets that I'm going to be chewing on for a week and a half to come at least.
Yeah.
But good. As you said, we do probably need to start closing up this conversation. So do you have any resources that you'd like to throw in as far as like maybe resources for this particular topic or resources where people can go to find more information about not being the one that is isolated?
Sure. Yeah, Brent. You know what? And I was like, where do I point? I would say just no. Look to me as a resource in this. Like that's literally my job right now, is to try to just be available, find the space for that pastor saying, I don't have anybody to talk to about blank.
Yeah.
I would love to be the one talking about blank. And the beauty is you don't report to me. You don't have, I don't have any skin in the game on what you do other than just caring about you. And if that's a Zoom call, or if you're near Northern Indiana and it's at a coffee shop or wherever else, the thing I always say is whatever you share stays here unless I have to report you to the police. And even then I'll think twice about it. I want you to feel that safe, that's that. So in that, like that's, and it's free. It's free. It's because of incredible supporters. It's something that's just a free space. So there's that. And then the other part, a resource would be, I've started something. It's interesting. You brought up the Google Hangout thing. Last January, I said, you know what, I'm going to try this thing out. It's a cohort experience. It's 4 months in length. It's an every other week. It's a Zoom call. And usually bringing about 7 to 10 individuals as a part of it from all over. And then in the week between, we get into what we call triangles, smaller groups for just conversations. And on the 1 week, it's a full Zoom call. It's kind of a content driven, facilitated discussion. So I'm not there to like train. I'll do some stuff, but I'll bring on other people. But really, it's about us grouped together, coaching and talking, and then getting together. So we just started the fall version of that, but we'll be doing it again in January. I've got some people that are co-facilitating with me on it now. So those things are out there when it comes to this that I would throw out. But I'd also say look at National Network of Youth Ministries. See if you have a network in your area. That's a great space. What I'll say, Brent, is what I'll do is I'll send a link. I'll give you a link to my newsletter. I have a newsletter that I just sent out to ministers, and a lot of the information on how to get connected to me, as well as at the heart of those, really a big part is, hey, here's spaces or places to connect with others. So the website, in case people don't want to look at show notes, the easiest thing to do is just tinyurl.com/Derry, Derry newsletter. And if you go there, you can get to sign up for that newsletter, and I can send, that's where I put out information occasionally on when the next cohort's coming or other ways to connect.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, and that's the same thing goes on our side is, I mean, I, as well as Russell, are both certified youth pastor coaches. And so we like, that is our heart behind why we started this. So if you are needing that voice, we are very, very much in the same boat. As you can reach out to us, find us on social media, or send us an email, whatever you need to do in order for you to start the conversation on not being alone.
Love it, dude. And
I
do it, people. Reach out to them.
Yeah. You need to do it for the sake of you, the minister, and not your ministry.
There you go.
Because that is, I mean, ultimately, like, our job is to care about you. And so that is what we're trying to do. But that is all we have for this show. If you're a frequent listener of our podcast, all we ask is that you do your part to get our podcast out to the greater student ministry audience. Share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode that really stood out to you. Either way, be sure to tag us in the post with your favorite platform by using @TalkStudentMen. And then finally, if you'd like to be like Derry and be a guest on the show in the future, reach out to us on social media, send us an email, podcast@studentministryconversations.org, and we'd love to set up a time that you can come on the show with us, because our podcast is nothing without you guys coming on the show. And then finally, Derry, this has been a lot of fun, man. I feel like, you said, we've known each other for about a week, and I already feel like I made a friend. And so I appreciate the wisdom, appreciate the insight, and I very, very much doubt that this will be the last time we talk. But I'm excited for listeners to hear this one. And for everybody listening, we hope that you have a great week, and we will see you next time.